Welcome back to my channel. I'm Brian Kafke. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Databricks Assistant, which is a way to scale up your programming activities on Databricks. And a little spoiler alert, a little pop-up window here with the robot. The idea is that you're going to use AI to help you do your coding activities. I'm going to start with, what is the Databricks Assistant, Brian? Then we'll go into, how do I enable this so I can use those cool features? And I'll do a riveting demo, and really the demo is going to be the bulk of this video, but I do want to give you the first two so you'll know what we're doing and how to activate it yourself. Then I want to talk about something really important, which is, what do you need to know? What are the caveats? What are the potential issues you can run into? Because it really isn't just all rainbows and unicorns. There's a little bit to watch out for here. And then I'll wrap things up. So what is the Databricks Assistant? It is based on ChatGPT. You've probably heard all this. It's been all the rage in the media. It's one of those types of services. It's based around text, right? And if you've used it, you know you can type things into a prompt and then it will answer questions. It'll write essays for you. It can even do coding, right? And that last part, the doing coding and helping you, that's what this service is about. It's very similar to something new on GitHub, which Microsoft launched, which is Copilot. And I intend to do a video about that coming up too. Now, one of the things it can do is generate code based on things you ask for, which is really cool. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. But it can also evaluate and debug entered code. And you can paste code into the prompt and it will evaluate the code and it will also debug it. It will tell you what are the bugs in the code. Now, I was surprised because to use this service, you do not have to have a cluster running in your workspace, which is really nice because that saves you a little money. You can be just sort of coding offline. Python and SQL are supported by default, and the implications, it seems, in the documentation would be that's all you can do. It can't support other languages. But in reality, I was playing around and I asked it to code something in R, and it did. And I think the deal is, when you want a different language, you just have to say, I'd like you to write this in R, or I want you to write this in Ruby, or whatever other language you want to use. I'm not sure what all the languages are it supports, but I'm guessing it's pretty wide open since in the end, it's a language model that's going to try to search and find information about whatever you ask for. Another surprise for me was it supports the local Hive metastore. I didn't expect that. I really thought this was going to require Unity Catalog and only work with the metadata stored in Unity Catalog. Fortunately, you do not have to enable Unity Catalog to use this service. And that in the documentation was also not really clear because it said it leverages Unity Catalog. So I was kind of happy because I will do a video on enabling and using Unity Catalog, but I got to tell you, there's some additional expenses, like you have to have premium Databricks service running and you have to get ADLS Storage Gen 2 premium. So there's some extra costs in there that you need to do. So I could go in and stop playing and having fun with this new service without any additional cost. So the service is free for now, and I'll talk about that also in a minute. And the link I'm showing you here is a nice blog that talks all about what this service is, how to use it, what are all the different features. However, I do want to point out that it is not Azure specific. And by the way, the code and these slides will be available to you. I'll put a link in the description and you can go and get them for your very self. So let's talk about enabling the Databricks Assistant. You can see down below, there's a link there, right? https accounts-azuredatabricks.net. Now, I'm calling attention to that because the blog that they wrote up points you to a link, but that link doesn't tell you how to set it up on Azure. It tells you how to set it up on other platforms. I'm not sure. I'm guessing AWS. It didn't work for me, and so I had to look around. So I do want to tell you, if I haven't already said this in my other videos, when it comes to Azure, there's a lot of different features and integration which the other environments like AWS and Google may not have. The significance of that is that Azure has a completely different set of all Databricks documentation, meaning you want to make sure that when you're looking for anything about Databricks, you include the word Azure and make sure it talks about Azure, because anything that involves the platform will be different more than likely if it's running on Azure. Granted, the generic things like PySpark and everything else, it's probably going to be the same, but just be aware of that because this is one of those cases where you're using different links. And you can see the second one I kind of X'd out there, but that was the one that was mentioned in the blog that I'm guessing is what you would use with AWS. Okay. I also want to point out there's a link at the bottom that points you to a Microsoft blog. It's actually on Microsoft Learn, which gives you FAQs all about this service. So this is what you'll see when you go to that link. And this is the account admin screen for your Databricks. What does that mean, Brian? It's a relatively new thing on Databricks, new feature. And what it does is it allows you to administer and govern all of your Databricks workspaces from a single place. But to really use it, you need to enable Unity Catalog, because Unity Catalog is the sort of one ring to rule them all. The idea of Unity Catalog is to bring all of your workspaces under one umbrella so you can govern it, you can manage it, you can see it, and you can assign permissions. So it's a very powerful service, but I was happy to see I didn't have to enable Unity Catalog to use this service. What I did have to do is go into the admin portal, click on the settings. You can see there the little red widget there. Click on that. At the very bottom of the screen, you can see where you enable third-party services, it says AI assistive features. And that's great. Just click it and you're good to go. It will enable it across all your workspaces. So I do want to point out two things. And if somebody works at Databricks is seeing this, it knows better than me, feel free to put a comment in the description. But as far as I could see, when you click this on, it enables it across the board. All users, all workspaces. So that was a little strange to me. I think having more control to be able to say who should use it and can use it, as well as which workspaces you want it to be available in, especially in this state where it's new, you might want to just turn it on for dev. So I'd be careful about that a little bit. The other thing I wanted to point out here is if you read the details, it talks about kind of generically third-party services that they may call. And what that means is Databricks behind the scenes is actually using third-party services to do this translation to support the language features that you're getting. And that means you're dealing with another party that you don't have a contract with, right? You have a contract with Databricks or some sort of agreement through Microsoft, but this is something now they're extending that to include another party, maybe multiple parties. In fact, I know they use the Azure OpenAI and the OpenAI service because they talk about that later on. I'll show you. So that's another thing to be aware of. Now, the thing I want to call attention to specifically about this is my concern is that you don't know when, if they could expand it to include any number of other third parties or services. These things tend to be, read this 3,000-page legal document telling you what you're agreeing to, that they will also say can change without notice at any time. So again, just be a little bit careful there. I would personally, before I use this, especially like in full-on usage in a company, I would run it by my legal department if we had one, just to make sure that, there's nothing we're signing into that we don't want to. Okay, so we are now in an environment that has had the assistant feature enabled. And you can see I have a notebook on my right I brought up. And if you click on different panels here, a new icon shows up called the assistant. I can go over here and say, look at data. I have a cluster running and I can browse the Hive Metastore. I recently just did a video all about the Hive Metastore and forgot to go into this to show you that you can see your data in the Hive Metastore if you have a cluster running. And you can see I have several databases. A lot of times I just upload things from AdventureWorks. So I can look at like AW Project. I have typical things here. You can see I have Factor Internet Sales. So maybe I want to do some query around Factor Internet Sales or dim sales territory. This feature can even see what you have in the catalog. It knows what the attributes are and on and on. So that's a really nice thing to have. So having said all that, let's just jump in and start doing some code. Let's say I want to get some help doing a query. I'll start with something that uses the data since I just showed you the Hive Metastore. So I may want to say, show me the total sales amount and quantity. I'll put it this way, and sales grouped by, let's say, sales territory. Okay, and I'm just going to try to run this and see what I get. So this actually looks pretty good, right? It says select sales territory, and it does the sum, and it gives it an alias, total sales amount, total sales quantity, and it goes against the Hive Metastore, AW project, Fact Internet Sales. Now, interestingly, I didn't tell it which database, so it chose one for me. I'm going to just do a quick thing here. I'll try running this cut and paste. So I'm going to copy that out. And there it is. And I'm just going to run it and see if it works. Not bad. Not bad at all, actually. Now, I didn't want to get into joining and stuff like that. You could say join it to dim sales territory and put keys in and play around with that. I don't really know how intelligent it gets, but I'm guessing if I said by sales territory name and maybe add in and use this dim sales territory, probably figure it out. I don't really know how smart it is, but there it is. Seems pretty cool that it worked anyway, at least at that level. And rather than just kind of going through and cutting and pasting code, I decided to do something I think is a lot easier to follow along and evaluate how good the assistant works. So instead, I did a number of experiments trying to get the assistant to generate all kinds of code with increasing complexity and adjustments. I was pretty impressed with it. Not perfect, but I'm going to walk through that instead of the assistant because it's going to get tedious to kind of keep going back and forth so you can see how this works. So let me turn off this window a little bit so I can see more. I entered my requests in the assistant window and then I cut and pasted everything it gave back, including the documentation and comments. Now I really want to be careful here. This is for demonstration only. Do not run this on your own environment. I would say that across the board with anything with the assistant at this point. The reason I'm saying that is because you don't know what it's really going to do. So you have to vet the code, review it yourself. Now, this code should be pretty benign, but due diligence, I also want to give you that disclaimer. As you see, the code may not be perfect, and you want to vet and review any code before you run it, especially in a production environment. Consult the Databricks documentation to confirm that the Databricks Assistant service meets your organization's security and standards. It's using an outside service, and you need to check that and say, are you comfortable with that? The OpenAI service is known to take whatever you enter into it and store it in its own database. I don't really know how secure that is. You kind of could be releasing information to it. One thing I would say is never enter into the assistant or any ChatGPT service anything like user IDs, credentials, passwords, anything that you wouldn't want to go out there, or PII data like social security numbers or something like that. Not a good idea because it will send it out over and who knows where it may go. So you do have to be a little bit careful about that. The things that this service can do, I'm going to focus today on code generation, but it can also do autocomplete if you use it within a cell as you go. It can do debugging and even fix problems in your code. It can do code analysis and explanation, like what's happening in this code, which is good if you're trying to understand new code. And it can transform code. So you could say things like, take this function and make it a PySpark function, or take this R code and turn it into Python. I will say that it reminds me a little bit of using like a web search. You get better and better at sort of knowing how to ask for things and what specifically to give it to nudge it along. The challenge with writing code, and I know there's a lot of hype out there, our jobs are going to go away, they won't need us anymore. That is a far cry from the truth, and I think will be for quite some time. And if you try the thing, you'll know why. It actually takes more knowledge and a deeper understanding of the coding than if you didn't use the assistant at all, because it doesn't do things perfectly. So you have to know how to fix it. But the other part of it is, it doesn't know what questions to ask. So when you're asking it for things, if you give it additional information, and the more knowledgeable you are as a data engineer, the more you can kind of nudge it and say, well, okay, when you do this, could you also include like coding for Kafka instead of just like Spark or something? All right, let's walk through the kind of thing I did in my request. So I just decided when I did this, I said, hey, write some code to load a Spark data frame from a CSV file. And I was in a notebook like this. It was a Python notebook. So by default, it seemed to just go to Python, but not always. That was kind of interesting. But this is what it came back with, right? Not bad. I did not tell it what data set. I just sort of said anything, right? So I like what it did because it used one of its built-in demo data set diamonds. So in theory, I should be able to run this, and I don't think there'll be a problem. I'm going to add a little line here, though. Do it like this, display DF. You can see, yep, worked. So nice. Not very complex, but pretty cool. It also made the assumption that the column headings were in the file, right? And that it would infer the schema. Now, it knows about this particular data set, so it knew how to interpret that. It doesn't know what you'll be using when you ask this question. So when I said do this, it just made some assumptions, which is reasonable to do. And then it also gave a nice explanation of what this code does, which is pretty good. Now, one thing I noticed it didn't do, though, it didn't do like a little comment in here that said what it does. Instead, it gave me something after the fact. So now I said, oh, well, okay, that's pretty good. But let's convert the code into a function. Now, it worked. And what I like about this is that it knew what I had requested before. So it knew I just wrote a Python script to load a file to a data frame. Now it can say, I'm going to take that same code and rewrite it as a function. So I did this, and let's see if this works. So I had to add the magics above it to define what the cells were going to be depending on what you are running in a notebook. I have a SQL notebook here, and so I put that in. But overall, I think it's a pretty good function. Gives you the name of your function here, takes in a parameter, a file path. In this case, it did put in a doc string, and then it says data frame df equal, and it did this load just like before, and then it returns df. So what do I not like about this? Well, for one thing, it did not use a type hint. So typically here you would do something like this, which is a nice idea when you're writing code. I'm also not keen on this df. I'd rather have it say something like, I usually like prefixes like spdf, meaning Spark Python data frame. Things like that you have to be careful of. It's not bad. It's a workable function. Seems good. So then I entered a request, write the code to call the function and load the data frame into a Delta table. So a little more going on here. So this already knows it wrote this function, so it's going to call it. It's going to call the good old diamonds CSV file, right? But then it does df write, and it writes the format out. Overwrite, again, see, it's assuming. I didn't tell it whether it should overwrite, create new, maybe error if it's not already there, things like that. So it just assumes, and then save as table, diamonds. So there's a lot of things going on here. Okay, looks like it worked, no problem, great. And it gave a little documentation, good. So then I thought, let's add to the code that has already been written the count of the number of rows in the Delta table. And of course, I'd like to see that. So it's kind of like, okay, you bring it in, you load it, and that tells you how many rows it loaded. This is how I worded that statement. And interestingly, it first came back with this, all right, in SQL. And you'll notice what it did. It actually rewrote it. And mind you, I didn't actually ask it to go to SQL, but it kind of rewrote my code in a SQL format. Of course, if I try to run it, it says you already have that there, so it wouldn't work. So it did do a little strangeness, and this is where you have to understand what it's giving you. If you're just blindly doing this and you don't understand, you're going to get into trouble. So now I decided to be a little more explicit. Add to this Python code, count the number of rows in the Delta table and display it. And now it says Python, great. Now it didn't use the function it had written earlier. It just kind of started all over again, but let's see if it works. So it wrote this here and it said format Delta. Apparently where it wrote this isn't where it had written it before. So it's having a problem finding this file. We can use SQL to figure out where exactly it really is, right? We can say describe table extended. Okay, so using describe table extended, we can see that this is where it actually put the diamonds table, but it's trying to load it from here. Not sure why. Again, it's not perfect. Then I said, turn this code into a Delta live table pipeline. Admittedly, at this point, it's a little gaffed up the code, but I just kept going. What I really was interested in seeing is, can the assistant help you write Delta live table pipelines? Now, I was actually somewhat encouraged. It doesn't seem to understand Delta live tables as I show you this, but it wasn't a bad start. Like if you had this, then I could tweak it into what I wanted. So what did the Python code do? It starts by defining a path to the file. Then it defines a schema to that file. And then it treats it as a Spark read stream, which isn't bad in the sense I kind of like just that you're getting the code format you need for this, but it's going to do a read stream. Then it's going to take the stream and do a write stream out, setting up checkpoints and things. So it is giving you a lot of the syntax you would need to do this kind of thing. And then it's going to read that into a Delta data frame. It's going to do a count, but it's not actually doing anything with Delta live tables. In fact, it doesn't seem to even really understand that what a Delta live table is as far as I can see. It seems to be more just trying to do something that will write to a Delta table. And it gives you this detailed explanation. Finally, I said, add code to read from Azure Key Vault, and I gave the name, my Key Vault, to get an access token, right? And I said, here's an example. And this was actually pretty good, I like, because it gave me the libraries, but then it said my secret name, my Key Vault. So you can see now, suppose I said, and by the way, here's a password or something. It may have actually included that. I didn't bother doing that here, but you can see that you could get into some trouble because if it did, then that to me says it's sending that information around and the AI service is going to get that and store it. So again, be careful there, but it sets up a secret in a key vault. I'm sure this won't work. I don't have this set up, so I don't think I'll run it. But you can see it sets up sort of a path here to get to the key vault, assuming I had that set up, and the client secret set up, all this stuff. So it's a pretty good start of a script to just do this type of connection. But again, it won't work. I don't have the services on the back end set up. And that's why you really can't use it to write end-to-end processes. You would have to give it things you don't want to give it to be able to do it properly. Even things like giving it key vault names and things like that, I wouldn't do because, that's a step in the direction of getting into your data. Finally, I said, convert the code into a data-driven framework because I wanted to see if it could understand the concept of iterating over things. And what it came up with, first it created this JSON. So I figured, okay, it's going to store the metadata in JSON, and it put in like the configuration data there and explained it a little bit. Then it gives you a lot of documentation about what it's going to do next, but it didn't actually do a lot. It came across as really more documentation like, okay, do this, do this, do this. And it's really more around the Azure Key Vault stuff that it's trying to really just parameterize it, right? So I wanted to try something a little more advanced, and it didn't quite get what I was looking for, and that makes sense. It's my bad for not giving it a better explanation. So I say convert the code to iterate over a dictionary of Event Hub topics to load. I think that's pretty explicit. Of course, I'm not giving it any Event Hub information. Just a shell of code should come back. And it imports all the libraries I'm going to need, which is great. It's going to read a JSON file in. That's going to be, I guess, where it's going to pull the data from. Sets up all this information. And I like this part. I assume it works, but it's pulling in the topic name and table name, iterating over config topic table mapping, doing the dot items. So it's going to essentially be stepping through each row in the config, setting up Event Hub streams, setting up something for local blob. Not sure if that's necessary, and then it's setting up the stream here. So you can see what it's doing. Set up the Event Hub. It's going to be writing to a temporary blob to hold the data as like a buffer. Then it's going to do this part, which is going to read the stream, and then it's going to take it and write the stream out. Kind of a good shell again. I don't think you could use that as is in any way, but again, it could be something where you say, kind of give you a good skeleton program to start with. So then I just said, well, add documented comments to all this, right? And it said, sure, here's an example of how you can add documented comments. So then it went through and gave you all these comments. And again, all it's really saying is you can put dash dash before if it's SQL. But I'm, again, really in a Python notebook, so not ideal. And finally, as you saw, I'm not going to go into much details about this, but I decided to try using the Hive Metastore. So I have in demo a table called dim geography. So I said, summarize the data in dim geography. And the assistant came back and it wrote this nifty query. And indeed, okay, once I changed it to SQL instead of Python, it seemed to work pretty well. No groupings, nothing special. There are Python functions and things that could do a better job just doing this, but I wanted to see what it would come back with. It also wrote this other function, and let's see what that comes back with. It's doing a little more grouping. And so here it did it by country, region, code, total rows, average cities per state. So again, I didn't tell it to anything specific. It grabbed the columns. It did this. It's not a bad thing to get. It's kind of cool. And I tried get me the total quantity and sales for each product. And this is kind of what I did just a minute ago. And you saw that, wrote the query, gives you the results. And then finally, before I close up on this demo, I said, show me this as a pie chart. I didn't really say what this is. I assumed it would take the summary that's by product key and show that as a pie chart. And the code was kind of interesting. First, it generated this SQL code. I'm going to replace that with SQL to make it work. But then what's really strange is it's summarizing by country region code, but I didn't have data by that. I had it by product key. So that was a little strange. Then it did this version in Python, right, where it imports libraries and does a pretty good shell. But again, it's somehow it got hung up on this whole country region code thing. And it gave me a kind of meaningless pie chart. So not even a pie chart, really. I don't know what exactly it was doing, but not what I was looking for. So as you can see from this, it's a bit convoluted, right? Not exactly A++. And admittedly, I gave it pretty crappy prompts to work with. But I think that's what people are going to do. I'm not going to just feed it, nice, simple things that it's going to do. I'm going to see how much it can help me. If it's only going to give me a few lines of code, well, then I can just get it off, Google search or something, cut and paste, and I'm good to go. Usually I can use snippets. I have usually skeleton programs, but I did like it. I thought it was very cool. I loved the fact that it can read the Hive Metastore. I really like the fact that I could say, hey, can you give me an example? Like I did that whole thing where I said, do something using a meta-driven framework, but I also said iterate over the config settings, and it came up with a pretty good starting point for a shell of what you need to do that. Not much of this code was like just run it as it is, which is why, again, you actually have to understand a good deal about it. I didn't hit any of these examples where you get what they call an illusion, where it just gives you some really strange variable or word that doesn't even make sense. So that was good. But you will need to be able to review the code and vet it and see if it makes sense and can help you in a given situation. It can help you learn, but it can also introduce some bugs which you might have a hard time figuring out why it's not working if you don't already understand the language. So oddly, it's a good tool for people who already know what they're doing. Might not be so good if you don't know what you're doing. But if it works for you, then at least you'll understand, oh, okay, that's how I do this. If it doesn't work, well, you got a good project digging in. So that's great, Brian. It's awesome. I'm going to jump in right now and turn it on and go to town. Well, there's some things you need to know. As I mentioned and kind of beaten to death, there's potential security risks, and this is what you can find on the documentation. It says Databricks Assistant may use third-party services, right? That's what I mentioned. You don't, as an organization, have an agreement with these companies. Databricks does. So there's some potential there that you've got to be aware of. They use Azure OpenAI and OpenAI. Now, mind you, they say including, they don't say only or exclusively. So they could add on or may already use some other third-party services they're not telling you about. They're telling you about these. These services are subject to their respective data management policies. I don't know what that means. I don't know what the data management policies are, except they tell you data sent to these services is automatically purged within 30 days. I'm not sure I feel comfortable that if something was out there for 30 days, that's good. And it is not used for any model training. I am a little concerned, like I don't know, like what happens if you gave this to business people who don't know better than to feed in credentials or put in PII data or something like that. Not sure. Maybe it no risk. I don't know. And then it says for detail C, Azure data management policies and OpenAI API data usage policies. That's where you're going to start to get to the point of legalese, 50, 60 pages of documentation. And let's face it, we usually do this at Facebook or somewhere, and we just go, sure, you can take all my stuff. I don't need privacy. You want my photos. It's okay you do that personally, but you can't do that at a corporate level. That's kind of risky. So you probably want to vet through some of this. Maybe I'm a little paranoid, but I'm going to go on the side of caution. As I mentioned, I don't like that it's enabled at the account level. I would recommend, if you're going to play with this and use it, create an entirely separate account. If you have a MSDN Visual Studio type license, that gives you an automatic, I think it's $150 a month of Azure resources. So that would be a great way that you could go in there and you could play with it in a sandbox. It's just you. You can add your friends, have a good time. There's no risk. I would be careful using this in a real corporate environment. It can give bogus results. We saw some of that. We didn't see the whole thing where it gets illusions, where it just gives you something really crazy, but a lot of it wasn't quite on point. As I mentioned, and I beat this to death in this, verify, review all the code before executing it. You should always do that with any code. And the good thing is we're not going to be getting rid of our programmers anytime soon, but it is pretty smart. And because it is smart, you may want to consider that this will get better. I think these tools are just going to get better and better. And there may be a point where it's really doing a lot of the coding for us. That's okay. They'll always need us architects. Finally, this service is in public preview. You can use it, play with it, have fun for free for now. I assume at some point Databricks is going to want to make some money off this and charge for it. And you'll have to keep your eyes open. And when that happens, take a look at it and see if you want to pay whatever it costs. Something also you should know about public preview is it means that those features can change without notice. They could pull it. I mean, public preview is pretty good at its wide usage, but I would not recommend you to move anything into production. I would say never use a preview feature in production unless you really know what you're doing, because there's potential risks involved in that. So where have we been? Well, we talked about what is the Databricks Assistant, and the bottom line is it's a coding assistant. It will help you write code. It will help you debug, analyze, and do all these things with code. It's kind of like a little helper. I think the name Copilot is a good name that they use for GitHub's version of this, because Copilot, it's kind of helping me fly the ship here. It's going to help me figure out the code, debug, and things like that. I didn't go into the debugging part of this, but that looks like an awesome section of features because they can really drill down on that, and using error messages and doing a lot of, that sort of search logic give you meaningful translations of error messages and coding errors. So I think there's really great potential in that part of things. We walked through how to enable the Databricks Assistant, and you learned that you do not have to have Unity Catalog, yay, but you do have to get into the account admin panel and turn it on. But that's about it. Then all of your workspaces will have it. We saw a riveting demo where we got, I think, a little bit of mixed results, but I'm actually pretty excited about it, and I do intend to use the service. I think it's actually really cool. And things you need to know, I talked about a lot of things. I kind of try to give you all the warnings. Think of your own warnings. Put them in the comments. But I am always a little cautious about any new services. This one raises a few alarms in my mind more than others. The ChatGPT phenomenon that has been going on now for, I don't know, almost a year or so is something I've never seen in my career. It's something this quick, just came out of the blue and everyone's talking about it, non-technical media. But I do think you have to be careful about it before you jump in. And most companies I've seen are taking a cautious approach to it. They are concerned about security risks. They realize that data is going out into an open service. And so what you will be seeing is more and more of these wrapped GPT services that will do things for you in more and more secure ways, in more and more transparent and visible ways, so that you can make sure you're not doing anything you don't want to do. We're still at the early stages. I mean, it just came out like out of nowhere, and here it is. So keep tuned, keep watching. I mean, we've got Microsoft doing stuff. You got Databricks doing stuff. I just saw something the other day. Jupyter Notebooks are adding support. They have support for their own assistant. It's everywhere. So thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. Until next time, I'm pulling for you. We're all in this together. Thank you.